It started on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in our perfectly manicured neighborhood, the kind of place where hedges are trimmed like soldiers and rules hang heavier than the summer humidity. Kids played at a distance, retirees walked tiny dogs, and a handful of HOA board members hovered around the park like hawks protecting prey. No one watching that day could have imagined the chaos about to unfold. When a notorious HOA Karen, famous for weaponizing every bylaw in the book, suddenly shoved my frail, Alzheimer's-stricken father off a park bench, she thought it was just another petty power move. She didn't realize she had just kicked open a door to a past I'd kept locked for years, because I wasn't just a protective son. I was a retired CIA operative who had buried secrets on the entire HOA board. If you're tired of HOA horror stories that end with residents getting steamrolled, you're going to want to hear this one. Because what happened after that shove makes every other neighborhood drama look like a playground spat. Before I dive into exactly how this HOA's little kingdom collapsed, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button so you don't miss the jaw-dropping twists ahead. Each detail you're about to hear is a domino that leads to an ending no one in that boardroom saw coming, and you won't want to miss a single piece of it. The afternoon had started quietly. My father, once a respected math professor, now a gentleman lost in the fog of Alzheimer's, loved sitting under the oaks in our community park. It was his last connection to the world. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of wind and leaves, and the comforting texture of the worn wooden bench he always chose. That bench wasn't just wood and nails. It was a fragile lifeline to his fading memories. For months I had watched Karen, the HOA president and self-appointed enforcer, strut around issuing citations for improper bird feeding and unapproved flower pots. She treated the park as her personal boardroom, waving laminated rules at anyone who dared linger too long. Residents had grumbled for years, but fear of fines and legal threats kept them quiet. As my father and I approached that bench, she was already on patrol, sunglasses glinting like mirrors, clipboard in hand. She eyed us the way a mall cop eyes a shoplifter. My father sat gently humming a tune from his youth, unaware of the storm bearing down. Karen marched over, accusing him of violating bench reservation rules, a policy no one had ever heard of. Before I could even stand between them, she put both hands on my father's shoulder and shoved. Time slowed. His thin frame tipped, his knees buckled, and his head angled toward the concrete. Training from my years in covert operations took over. I lunged, catching him inches from impact, but in that instant I saw red. Karen smirked, muttering about people who don't belong, and strutted away, oblivious to the dozens of eyes watching. Neighbors gasped but stayed frozen, too scared to intervene. That was the moment I decided this wouldn't be another ignored HOA horror story. I set my father back on the bench, calming him as he trembled in confusion. Inside, a switch flipped. In the CIA, patience and preparation are weapons. You don't confront your target in anger. You dismantle them in silence until their entire network collapses under its own weight. As Karen disappeared behind the playground, I mentally mapped out the next steps. For the next week, I played the dutiful son on the surface. I took my father to his appointments, waved politely at neighbors, and even nodded at Karen when she strutted past. But under that calm exterior, I was running a full operation. Miniature pinhole cameras went up on my balcony with a clear view of the park. I set up a burner laptop linked to public databases, contractor filings, and HOA financial disclosures. Late at night, while my father slept, I combed through everything, bylaws, invoices, vendor contracts, and began spotting anomalies. Overpriced landscaping contracts paid to shell companies. Dues raised without membership votes. Secret meetings at a local cafe with a developer known for bribing municipal officials. Karen and her allies weren't just petty. They were running a racket. Each file I opened was another piece of leverage. My years of intelligence work had taught me how to build a case layer by layer until it was unassailable. I didn't just want Karen embarrassed. I wanted her entire corrupt machine dismantled. One evening, after securing my father for the night, I tailed Karen at a distance as she left a closed HOA meeting. She drove to a storage unit across town, a place she clearly thought was secret. From a parked car across the street, I photographed her unlocking it. The next day, using a pretext only a trained operative could craft, I got inside. Boxes of shredded documents, kickback checks, and USB drives waited like buried treasure. I took everything, cataloging it carefully. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior escalated. She began issuing my father bogus violation notices, unauthorized sitting, loitering, even bench damage. She thought intimidation would drive us out. Residents whispered sympathy but didn't dare stand up. They didn't know that every threat she made was now being recorded on hidden microphones I had placed under the meeting table and along the park fence. I had her voice, her words, her entire scheme on tape. By the end of the week, I had a dossier thick enough to bring down a senator, let alone a petty HOA tyrant. But I wasn't going to the police yet. Timing was everything. In covert work, you wait until your target overreaches. Then you strike so hard there's no recovery. My father's health was declining, and each trip to the park was riskier, but he insisted. The bench was his refuge. One morning we arrived to find a reserved for HOA use sign bolted to it. Karen stood nearby, smirking. I guided my father to another bench and took a deep breath. The trap was almost set. That night I compiled a media package. Documents, photos, and a short video montage, including the shove I'd captured on a discreet lapel cam. I sent it anonymously to 3 investigative reporters known for exposing local corruption. Within 24 hours, the first article hit the news. HOA president accused of fraud and elder abuse. Karen panicked, calling emergency board meetings, threatening lawsuits, blaming everyone but herself. She still had no idea who was behind it. As the headlines multiplied, my plan entered its second phase, direct pressure. I began sending anonymous tips to state regulators and tax authorities. Inspectors descended on the HOA office, seizing files. Residents grew bolder, confronting board members in public. For the first time in years, Karen looked rattled. But she wasn't finished, and neither was I. As Chapter 1 closes, the neighborhood stands on the edge of revolt, Karen's empire cracking under the weight of its own corruption. She's desperate, clawing to maintain control. I'm calm, watching from the shadows, my father's frail hand in mine. The next move will decide everything. Karen's empire was beginning to crumble, but the cracks only made her more dangerous. For years, she had controlled this neighborhood like a petty monarch, handing out fines and humiliations. And now that power was slipping through her fingers, she clawed harder. Blind to how exposed she'd become, I kept my head down, playing the role of weary son while running a full-scale operation behind the curtain. Every evening after I tucked my father into bed, I monitored local news chatter, watched board members' social feeds, and fed new leaks to the right people. In intelligence work, you never go for the kill until the enemy has isolated herself. And Karen was doing it for me. Board members began quitting under pressure. Those who stayed started whispering about the leak and the mole. What they didn't know was that their cell phones were already feeding me a second stream of data. Karen had grown paranoid enough to order new security patrols around the park. She posted laminated notices threatening trespass charges for sitting on benches without authorization. She even had a contractor install cameras facing the walking path. Cameras I'd already disabled from a distance using a trick we used overseas. Her tantrums only produced more material. One afternoon, she confronted an elderly couple over a hanging plant, and I caught the entire exchange on a high-resolution zoom lens. The footage of her shrieking at retirees would later become one of the clips that sent the internet into a fury. My father sensed none of this. His world had shrunk to simple rituals, and I protected those with everything I had. When we walked to the park now, neighbors would glance at us with sympathy and then at Karen with growing disgust. A quiet alliance was forming, though they didn't yet realize they were part of something larger. I did. I fed anonymous tips into residents' group chats, encouraging them to demand a financial audit. I left copies of suspicious invoices on doorsteps. At night, my burner laptop hummed as algorithms cross-referenced payments, contracts, and board member relatives. Every day the picture became clearer. A kickback scheme stretching back years, HOA funds routed to family-owned companies, illegal evictions of fixed-income homeowners to make way for cash buyers. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was orchestrating a criminal enterprise under the cover of a neighborhood association. The media caught scent of the larger story, and investigative reporters began camping near the subdivision entrance. Karen tried to spin it as fake news, but her allies were gone and the documents were undeniable. Still, she doubled down. She began personally delivering violation notices to my door, each one more absurd than the last. Improper shade of mailbox paint, unauthorized footwear on community pavement, excessive loitering by guest. The notices were bait, and I let her deliver them, each one captured on a hidden camera. The more she tried to intimidate me, the deeper she dug her own grave. My plan for the second phase was to escalate public pressure. Using contacts from my CIA days, I arranged for the leaks to appear not only in local media, but on national HOA watchdog blogs and viral social accounts. Within a week, hashtags sprouted like weeds. Q Benchgate, Ho Karen, Q Justice for Dad. The video of my father being shoved played on loop with captions about elder abuse and corruption. Comment sections filled with thousands of furious viewers sharing their own HOA horror stories. Karen, who had thrived on fear and secrecy, now found herself a meme. She tried to file a restraining order, claiming harassment, but the footage undermined her case and the judge refused. That hearing produced its own viral clip. Karen storming out of the courtroom, red-faced and silent, while reporters shouted questions. Residents began organizing in earnest. A petition to remove the board hit the required signatures in 2 days. Protest signs appeared at the park entrance. Cars drove by honking support. For the first time, my father smiled at the commotion, sensing that the place that had frightened him was changing. But Karen still held the HOA bank accounts and bylaws. She used them like weapons, freezing maintenance on common areas, threatening to tow residents' cars, hiring private security to patrol the streets at night. Neighbors began calling me at odd hours, frightened of retaliation. I reassured them anonymously while quietly preparing the third phase, direct legal strike. My dossier had grown massive. Scanned checks, audio files, screenshots of offshore transfers. Through a friend at the Attorney General's office, I arranged for a sealed investigation. Agents began interviewing former contractors, comparing notes, building their own case. I didn't need to push them. The evidence spoke for itself. Karen's panic escalated to recklessness. She began holding emergency board sessions at odd hours, texting threats to residents and moving boxes out of the storage unit I'd already raided. I documented it all. Each move she made now was being mirrored to my secure drive in real time. One night, while watching the feed from a concealed trail cam near the park, I saw Karen rip down a protest sign and scream into the empty playground. That 30-second clip became the spark that turned local outrage into national attention. Morning shows picked up the story, framing it as a symbol of HOA abuse across the country. The subdivision turned into a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the street, drones buzzed overhead, and Karen's once loyal enforcers stopped showing up. Alone and besieged, she tried one last tactic, claiming victimhood. She called a press conference on the clubhouse lawn, blaming outside agitators and Russian bots for the leaks. I stood at the back of the crowd, ball cap low, watching her self-destruct. My father held my arm, bewildered but calm as neighbors shouted questions Karen couldn't answer. When she finally fled into the clubhouse, I knew the time had come for the third phase. My contacts had everything they needed to move. Arrest warrants were being typed. Search teams were assembling. All that remained was to choose the moment to reveal myself and deliver the final blow. The neighborhood had transformed from a sleepy enclave into a battleground of signs, cameras, and hashtags. Karen's power was now a hollow shell, but she didn't yet understand that she'd already lost. As the sun set behind the park that evening, I guided my father back to the bench she had tried to take from him. He touched the wood as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. I looked around at the gathered neighbors, on once silent, now bold, and felt the weight of years of training settle into a single clear purpose. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was liberation. Chapter 2 closes with Karen barricaded in her crumbling kingdom, the Attorney General circling, the media feasting, and me, the quiet retired operative she had underestimated, ready to step from the shadows and end it all. Karen was barricaded in her crumbling kingdom, but she still didn't realize the net around her had already closed. In my world, Phase 3 was always the reveal. The moment you step from the shadows, control the narrative, and force the opponent to implode under their own weight. Everything I'd done so far had been about building pressure without leaving fingerprints. Now it was time to press my advantage and turn pressure into collapse. The Attorney General's investigators were ready. The warrants were signed. The media was ravenous. All I had to do was orchestrate the timing so the story detonated in a single, unavoidable blast. That morning began like any other. My father and I walked to the park, our slow ritual under the giant oaks. The bench was still marked reserved for HOA use, but residents had started ignoring the sign, sitting there in quiet defiance. Someone had even taped a printed photo of Karen's shove to the backrest with the words, "Never again," scrawled in marker. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of sorrow and determination. My father sat gently humming, unaware of the digital chess game surrounding him. I opened my phone and saw the messages from my contacts. Ready when you are. That night I moved into the final staging. On my burner laptop I assembled a video package designed to go viral in minutes. Footage of Karen shoving my father, audio of her threatening residence, scans of fraudulent invoices, screenshots of offshore transfers, even clips of her screaming alone in the park. The narrative was tight, undeniable, and enraging. With one click, I scheduled it to drop across multiple platforms at 9 a.m. the next morning. Simultaneously, I sent a secure message to the Attorney General's office. Tomorrow. Then I slept for the first time in days. At dawn, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. I took my father out for a short walk, then returned home and set up a discreet camera in my window with a view of the clubhouse. At 8:59 a.m., my finger hovered over the keyboard. At 9 a.m., the video dropped. Within minutes, my phone buzzed like a beehive. Notifications exploded. Shares, comments, tags, outrage. Hashtags leapt to the top of trending lists. The story moved from local bloggers to national outlets in under an hour. By noon, cable news anchors were running the clip in loops. HOA president accused of elder abuse and fraud scrolled across screens nationwide. Karen emerged from the clubhouse around 10 a.m., clearly unaware of the storm. She was on her phone barking orders, waving at the security guard who no longer looked at her. Then the first reporter arrived, then another, then a dozen. Microphones thrust toward her face, cameras rolling. Did you shove an elderly man? Did you embezzle HOA funds? Are you resigning? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. She turned and fled back into the clubhouse as the crowd jeered. Inside my house, I watched the feed from my hidden cameras as investigators approached. Unmarked cars slid to a stop. Agents in plain clothes walked briskly to the door carrying warrants. By 10:30, they were inside, seizing files and hard drives. Karen tried to live stream herself, claiming persecution, but the agents calmly read her rights. The image of her being led out in handcuffs, still wearing her HOA badge, would become the definitive meme of the saga. My father sat beside me, puzzled but serene as neighbors gathered outside to cheer. The sense of fear that had gripped them for years dissolved like smoke. People hugged, waved at the agents, some even cried, yet my work wasn't done. The board still existed on paper and Karen's allies might try to regroup. I had anticipated this. Along with the evidence, I had prepared a full draft of new bylaws and a resident-run committee structure ready to hand over to the community. That afternoon, while the news helicopters circled, I printed copies and quietly slipped them to the informal leaders of the residents' petition. They took it from there, calling an emergency meeting for that evening. Word spread through group chats, and by sunset, hundreds of residents filled the park. The bench where my father sat had become a kind of symbolic stage. They gathered around it, voices low but firm, voting to dissolve the old board and install an interim committee of neighbors. I stayed at the edge, letting them own the moment. My father dozed lightly against my shoulder, unaware that his simple need for a place to sit had ignited a revolution. The Attorney General's office called me at dusk. "We've got everything," my contact said. "Charges for fraud, elder abuse, tax evasion. She won't be back." I thanked them and hung up. No one but me and a handful of officials knew the full extent of my involvement. That was how I wanted it. This was about the community reclaiming itself, not about me. Still, there was one final step, revealing just enough of my identity to make sure no one tried this again. The following morning, I accepted an invitation to speak on a live local news segment. Standing in front of the park bench with my father beside me, I told the story calmly. I explained the shove, the bogus rules, the pattern of intimidation and fraud. Then for the first time publicly, I mentioned my background, retired intelligence work, without details. The effect was electric. Residents gasped. Reporters scribbled. The message was clear. The community wasn't helpless, and the next person who tried to exploit it might be facing someone with the skills to fight back. Clips of that interview spread as fast as the original leak. Headlines shifted from HOA scandal to retired operative topples corrupt HOA. My inbox flooded with messages from people in other states asking for advice on fighting their own boards. I replied to none. I had done what I came to do. But the story was still unfolding. Karen's arrest was only the beginning. Plea deals and further indictments were in the pipeline. The developer who'd been paying kickbacks vanished. The contractor admitted everything. As weeks passed, the neighborhood transformed. The park benches were repainted and dedicated to residents who'd suffered under the old board. Fences were repaired, playground equipment replaced, and a quiet pride replaced the fear. My father, though still lost in his own fog, began smiling more on our walks. He hummed louder, as if some part of him recognized the shift. Chapter 3 closes with the neighborhood reborn, but the deeper consequences still rippling outward. I had stepped from the shadows just long enough to ensure change, but I knew the story wasn't quite over. Karen still had lawyers. The media still wanted more, and I had to decide whether to fade back into anonymity or use what I knew to help others. That choice would define the final chapter. In the days following the explosive meeting, the neighborhood underwent a transformation that no one could have imagined. The board, stripped of its corrupt leadership, scrambled to regain the trust of the community. New elections were scheduled, and for the first time in years, residents felt empowered to vote for candidates who genuinely cared about fairness and safety. The park where my father had been shoved became a symbol of change. Volunteers landscaped it, added fresh benches, and posted a plaque dedicating the space to all vulnerable residents who deserved dignity and respect. My father, though still battling the haze of Alzheimer's, smiled when he saw it. He may not have remembered every detail, but he felt the warmth of the crowd who came to greet him, the applause, the tears of neighbors who had been silent for too long. Even the media attention brought a wave of new scrutiny to HOA practices nationwide. Journalists highlighted the abuse of power and the lack of oversight that allowed people like Karen and her allies to operate unchecked. Karen herself was facing a very different reality. The footage of her shoving my father, her unrepentant rants, and the revelations of secret deals had gone viral across social media. News channels replayed her outbursts with headlines about the HOA tyrant who met her match. Sponsors dropped her from local ventures, and even her closest supporters distanced themselves. At the disciplinary hearing convened by state authorities, she appeared pale and nervous, no longer the unshakable figure she once projected. She was forced to resign from all positions, and legal investigations into financial misconduct began to unfold. She never apologized directly, but her fall from power was public and absolute. For me, the end of the conflict was bittersweet. Years in the CIA had taught me how to dismantle corrupt networks quietly, but this was the first time I'd done it in my own backyard, in defense of my own family. I walked my father to the park bench one last time, sitting with him under the new plaque. He looked at me with a flicker of recognition, then whispered something about how proud he was of the community's strength. Even in his fading mind, he sensed that justice had been served. That moment was worth more than any covert success I'd ever achieved overseas. As new board members took office, transparency became their watchword. They instituted open meetings, accessible budgets, and community-led decision-making. Neighbors who once hid behind closed blinds now greeted each other with warmth, knowing they'd helped dismantle an oppressive regime. My skills as an operative had turned out to be a force for good, but the real victory belonged to the collective courage of ordinary people. The HOA had gone from a secretive club of bullies to a beacon of grassroots empowerment. Months later, a national morning show invited me and my father to share our story. We sat side by side under the bright studio lights, recounting how a single act of cruelty had sparked a movement for accountability. The host looked straight into the camera and said, "This is why you should never underestimate the quiet strength of people protecting their loved ones." The clip was shared millions of times. Messages poured in from other neighborhoods dealing with similar abuse. We'd become a symbol not just of resistance but of hope. As the credits rolled on that segment, I knew this chapter of my life was closing. My father's condition would continue to challenge us, but at least he would spend his days in a safer, kinder place. The fight with Karen and the corrupt board had been more than a personal vendetta. It had been a stand for everyone who had been silenced or intimidated. I took a deep breath and realized that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in far-off countries, but right at home, on familiar streets beside the people we love most. And as I walked away from the camera, I felt lighter, stronger, and ready to keep pushing for fairness wherever it was needed next. Because when communities stand together, even the most entrenched bullies can be brought down. That was the true lesson from the bench where it all began. and it was one worth sharing far beyond our neighborhood. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it gripping and inspiring, don't forget to tap the like button, share it with friends who'd love a good real-life thriller, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable HOA and Karen stories. Your support helps bring more hidden injustices to light, and we can't wait to share the next viral story with you.